Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to Quarantine. This is our 11th show after about 3 weeks. And as you know from the very start, the whole idea behind this is in the middle of this crisis innovation, we have seen the deep science community acting as one. We've seen responders and the kind of social activist community coming up with ways for people to stay safe. And we've been following kind of what are the mechanisms that might be reopening our cities. And in today's show, we're going to focus in on the kind of tools that help us think and model the world, and that we can use in this era of both complexity and exponential change. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitch, as well as YouTube. And our main homepage is Quarantine Today, quarantine.today. And if you come to our Facebook page, you can leave comments, and then we will be able to respond to them throughout the show. And today we've got 3 terrific guests. We're going to start with Kevin Kelley. Many of you know Kevin as one of the founders of Wired magazine, and is still kind of the spiritual leader of Wired and continues to help direct that. Kevin has written a lot about the tools that we use, and so we're excited to spend some time with him. And he's also one of the leads of The Long Now. We had Alexander Rose on a couple of weeks ago, and Long Now sits there thinking about long-term issues and then how that impacts how we're thinking now. So that's where we'll start. And Kevin's written a lot about tools. And then we have Azam Khan, who is a great systems thinker. I got to know him with Mickey over at Autodesk as he started modeling out how do buildings respond to people. Now he's working on how do you build complex structures like hospitals, and how can we build models of these that help us respond in a complex world. And we're going to have some fun heading into that. We're going to look at one of the founders of the whole ideas of dynamic system tools, complex systems thinking, Donella Meadows, who it turns out was a teacher of mine at Dartmouth many years ago. We have a clip of her from 1977 showing us how to model a pandemic. And then Tim Chang's going to come back. Many of you met Tim last week when we talked about spirituality, and he was talking about some of his work as a VC. Well, today he's going to come back with a tool that has been deployed in Bolinas that looks at how to test people at scale and begin to deploy contact testing so that perhaps in a bottoms-up way we can start opening our city. So that's what we're up to today. Let's welcome our co-host, Mickey McManus, to these microphones. Hi, Mick.
Hey, Peter. How you doing?
Excellent. You know, you have been our tools maven. On this show, we use not only our video tools and our Facebook tools, but we've also got Miro, our whiteboarding tool. And you've been spending a lot of time in your work over at BCG on how do we get people to collaborate at scale across distance, because as we saw in some of our earlier shows, we are using media and tools completely differently now that we're at home and in different contexts. You may want to just tee up how you think about tools.
Yeah, Omid, can you pull up the whiteboard? One of the things we've been trying to do is sort of experiment with tools. I've never really used Miro before, but I've said that looks kind of interesting. And so one of the things we've done is sort of every single episode we've been capturing this. And if you go to our site, to quarantine.today, you can actually click on Miro, and you can actually add Post-it notes, or you can add comments. You could say, oh, I want to add a Post-it and be able to do something. So you could come in here and say, some comment here. I could say, Mick, I'll just say a bad version of it. And we'll end up with a Post-it note that we can kind of, move around and be able to do things. So there are different things you can use. Each one of these has limitations. We're playing with lots of different tools. There's my weird one that I just did over there. But we could pull that off now, but we can jump back into it at certain times. I think, I started thinking about, could we have an episode where we talk about tools, but explicitly tools that like help with shared cognition, help us like get our head around complex things, and help us see about how it extends our reach. And so this whiteboard is interesting just because it's infinite. If you stretch to the left, it'll keep growing. It's got a map so you can zoom in and see where other people are drawing. It's synchronous and it's asynchronous. And I really like old-fashioned whiteboards because I know that drawing is like the lingua franca between disciplines. When people can't quite talk because they don't understand each other's jargon, you can say, well, draw a blob for a noun and draw an arrow for a verb, and suddenly you can actually collaborate together. And for this episode, we thought we would explore both just the cool tools that are out there and just talk a little bit about a few things, but also tools to help us with complexity itself. And that's one of the reasons I asked Azam if he could jump in, because he was the head of complex science research at Autodesk, and really working at how do you build authoring tools to cope with the complexity of the world, and sort of do something called goal-directed design, where you set the goals and someone else may set their goals and a third person might set their goals, and then you work with a machine learning system to generate possibilities, and then you explore that space. And Azam's been working on some pretty exciting things having to do with the SDGs, the big UN Sustainable Development Goals, and how we might kind of build them right into our systems to think about this future time.
Mick, this is a particularly interesting time to talk about tools because, on the one hand, our whole context of how we work together has changed, right? We're used to being in person and having meetings. Now that we're all kind of like remote brains in a box at home, suddenly we're realizing our tools sometimes fail us. We need different ways of working, right? So that's one thing that's driving this. And the other is, to this complexity point, boy, we're up against those issues, right? This pandemic has everything in it. It is nonlinear, it's global, it's complex, it kind of exceeds the ways that a lot of people normally think, and yet we're all engulfed in this problem. So it exposes our models of thinking, and that's why we're kind of interested in tools. A forthcoming show on May 6th, we're going to look at the global supply chain. And one thing we're going to find in that is it's also a dynamic systems problem. Things move slowly, all of the information isn't there. Let's bring Kevin Kelley in. Kevin, welcome.
Hi.
Boy, it's great to have you.
My pleasure.
You've been writing about this stuff for a long time, but let's start with this. You're part of the Long Now, which is an organization that really tries to take long-term thinking, looking at kind of systems and how we plan for the long term. You and everybody else on your Long Now show last week pointed out it's not like this was a surprise. Mm-hmm. I mean, people have been talking about modeling pandemics and how they're going to work for years, but it's both very tough for us to think that way, and you also made the point that people are kind of disappointed in science now, or coming up with their own theories, because science works by consensus, and we are moving faster than science. So what people would like to happen, or their mental models, are competing with kind of the scientific method and creating, I think, some of the discord we have today.
Yeah, and the discord is not between, say, those who are scientific and those who aren't, but even among those of us who admire science. We are, and the events are transpiring at a faster speed than science, as it's normally done, can come to a consensus. So we don't have a consensus on, say, who to believe. We have all kinds of experts, and for every expert, there's an anti-expert. And so you're kind of like, well, which of these scientists should I trust? Normally, that's not a problem, because over the course of time, a consensus would emerge, and one theory would be proven to be more true than another. But we don't have the luxury of having that time. So we're kind of out ahead of science, which makes it very, very uncomfortable for us, and is only increased the uncertainty about what's happening and what's going to happen. And that uncertainty, in a kind of curious way, almost reminds me of the singularity. The singularity, technically, was originally a physics term, and it was used to describe an event horizon beyond which no information would come out. And so it was literally impossible to know anything about what was going to happen inside that, beyond that horizon. And that's been transferred to the technological realm by Werner Vinge, who talked about technological singularity, which was often used in the context of, well, AI would happen and AI would make an AI smarter than itself. And we could not know what would happen afterwards. And that was the singularity. But we actually have kind of a mini singularity right now, in the sense that we're ahead of science and ahead of our way of knowing. And so everything that we look into the future now is just hugely racked by uncertainty. And we can't know until we settle some of the things about how the virus works, how global economies work, how lockdowns work, how these very large planetary systems that we know about but don't really know how they work. And so that uncertainty is almost like a singularity to us right now.
Yeah, and you had a piece last week where you talked about first and second order effects, right? And so not only does this have nonlinear components, but because we don't know how things behave, this tends to make you want to be cautious, right? This tends to make you say, well, if this is going to go nonlinear and a lot of people might die, we need to do this. And then on the other hand, you have this other completely unmodeled thing that nobody even thought about, which was if you stop the economy, what actually happens? What's the carnage? How much residual is there when you turn it back on? And probably people have done more modeling around pandemics than they have if you turn the economy off for 3 months, what then?
Right. I mean, how many people were forecasting negative oil prices? Right. I mean, it's like, I was just sending around a quote today, presumably from Oscar Wilde, says that we actually find it easier to believe in impossible things than in plausible things. I mean, so, negative oil prices is like, that's just really hard to believe, but here we are. So that kind of uncertainty is dangerous, as you say, because the remedies that we bring forth could be worse than the cure, even if they're the only remedies that we have. And that's sort of the problem right now, is that we really have only one instrument to deal with this, which is the social distancing and locking at home, which is a really heavy hammer. And it's the only instrument we have. We need scalpels, we need testing, we need all kinds of things that we don't really have online yet. So we kind of have to keep using this very brutal hammer that basically affects everybody instead of just the people who have the virus or are sick, which is really what the scalpel would be. And so because we have uncertainty as well, I think that we are in this new territory, as you kind of started off saying, that we're in a new regime with high uncertainty, and it's global. And so we have the absolute evidence where maybe for the first time in the history of this planet, we are undergoing the same thing. Everybody on the planet is undergoing the same thing, and we realize it, that we're global. So pandemics have probably swept through the planet before, but we weren't even aware of it. But now, for the first time, we have a global awareness that we're all experiencing the same thing together. And we probably have some ability to deal with it, which is also new. So there is a kind of an awakening, a global planetary awakening happening right now. It's not really under the circumstances that we might have imagined, but I think that's what it is. And it's a first. It's the first time for the planet.
Yeah, this notion that this is when there was a conference last week, and it posited that this was a singularity, right? And so these ideas that this is kind of a completely unique event seems to be rising to the fore. You saw that wonderful article, "The Hammer and the Dance," that talked about this crisis. The hammer is, okay, everybody goes home, slam it shut. And the dance is, we don't really know what it takes to open things up. So it's going to be lots of experiments and lots of testing and finding out what works. And there's something kind of scary about that, because, is it right Are we doing the right thing? Is it right for Georgia to open up and then another city to open up, or are there better methods that can be applied, or is this basically a whole lot of trial and error, and people are just going to have to make mistakes?
Yeah, I am adopting a little bit of a metaphor that we came out of a discussion with Peter Schwartz and the scenarios that we've been working on, where actually I was hoping to write something today, but I didn't get to it because of all the Zooming. It's the hammer and the scalpel. And we kind of, we don't know the exact things that we need to do, but we do know one thing, which is that that the best way to deal with this is in a scalpel, surgically dealing with only those who are sick or recently been sick or they're particularly vulnerable instead of everybody. That's the hammer. The hammer is like, you can't do that, so we're just going to touch everybody. But for whether we have a test, a treatment, prevention, all those things still only want to touch those that are affected. And so what we want to do is quickly evolve and make and develop the tests that give us a scalpel, a surgical touch, so that we only deal with those who are effective, who have the virus, who are actively suffering, or who have recently contacted someone else. And that is another tool we're talking about, tracing, tracking, and that brings into the issues of surveillance and privacy data. And I think that's where we can talk about tools, because I think there's going to be a change there, because we can't really have that surgical scalpel device unless we abridge somewhat some of our preconceptions about public health and privacy.
Let's talk about cool tools. You wrote this probably 8 years ago or so. You and Mickey also have been interested in tools, and there is this notion that we create these tools, they affect us, and this cool tools was kind of very much in the spirit of the original Whole Earth catalog that Stuart, who's your compatriot, worked on. Kind of what inspired this, and what inspires you today, especially since we're at home and we probably have time to learn tools, and we need to be inspired.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is I think tools are the revolution. I think oftentimes science advances by the invention of new tools. So the invention of the microscope opened up the huge small world, and things like the germ theory of infection, and you could almost say a huge amount of biology came about because we invented the microscope. And then, of course, the telescope went in the other direction, and our understanding of the cosmos and physics, which were all informed by our ability to look far. And one after another, tools have continued to create revolutions in how we know things and what we know. And so I've been a firm believer that access to tools is one of the central ways in which we change civilization, of how we change what we know, what we believe, what we think our purpose is through tools. So I have a very tool-centric view. And that was made concrete by this catalog of tools. If you page through it, there's thousands of tools, and you'll want all of them because they're all rave reviews about how great they are and what they can do. And the page you're looking at is the hand tools, which is one small set of tools. I define tools as anything that's handy and useful. So a map could be a tool, an online course could be a tool, a car, a vehicle, they all can be tools as well. And the purpose of this book was to introduce you to those possibilities. So the temptation is you want to buy them all, but the purpose of the book was not that you need to buy these. You need to be aware that they exist, that there are possibilities, because often just knowing that this tool exists will will inspire a bunch of ideas that you didn't even know. And of course, many times it'll inspire you to make something that you didn't know you can make, because now you have the right tool to do it. So I call it a catalog of possibilities. It's this idea that there are far more possibilities in the world than you're aware of, and this is one way to stretch to expand that universe of possibilities. I mean, YouTube is another way these days, but this is a way through, here are the tools that are available to you as an individual that can stretch what you think is possible for you as an individual or small group to do.
And we've definitely been stretching tools. We did a show a couple weeks ago on how kind of the world of entertainment or nightlife or just how you express yourself has been pushing on gaming technology and pushing on YouTube, right? Because we're trying to recreate experiences we have as humans, and suddenly we realize, okay, these instruments weren't built for that. But then there's Man the Tool Maker, and then you have like Burning Man, which is a physical, the world's most physical thing, saying we have to go virtual, and then you have a whole community like, well, what do we do with our tools to get there? Mickey, why don't you join us, because I know you have been at home using a lot of tools yourself.
Well, I have, yeah. I mean, I think tools shape the way we think, and I think that's a really important part of this. Is that if I am a hammer, I can think about ways of putting in nails, and I can think about ways of pulling out nails, and if everything looks like a nail to me if I'm a hammer, right? And I think a big part of this is I often study the kind of the journey from being an amateur or interested, and you sort of see the possibility, to how you actually become a virtuoso. And you're not always going to become a virtuoso in every tool. Maybe it's just that it exists, and then you learn somebody is great at it. I've often found that if you have a workshop and you have everyone come in for the weekend and they learn how to make like a little wooden box, they learn about like a bandsaw, they learn about a table saw, they learn about different kinds of things. They also learn that it's kind of dangerous, like you could cut your fingers off pretty easily. And just by making like a little jewelry box as a gift or something, you end up having this humble awareness. And I think that's, being an amateur is actually beautiful. You're not great at this yet, and you can ask all sorts of questions. You can be a student. But what's interesting is then, if you look around your house later, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful piece of wood. Look at the details they did on that. You suddenly have appreciation for people who are virtuosos. And so I often think about sort of how do we have that slope from amateur to virtuoso, or amateur to just appreciation and play with it. And yeah, one of the things that I made on our very first episode, we had Andrew Hessel, and he said, this is kind of like the world versus an alien threat, and we don't have a radar network. We can't even tell. We just have to wait until like people show up in the operating room, or in the ICU, or sadly pass away. And he said it's kind of a thing. And I said, well, I'll make an oh no globe, and death will rain down on the virus, or maybe death will rain down on the earth. And this was made with me tinkering around with some 3D printers. The virus itself is kind of like little. It's sending like little. Let's see if we can see it. Little death. It's skull and crossbones. And we talked a little while ago about loss and grief. And I thought maybe the Pope could save us. So I put the Pope inside there. I was raised Irish Catholic. But the act of me doing this kind of let me learn about these little photopolymer printers that are like $300 on Amazon now. And I printed like 50 little skull and crossbones like in 15 minutes. I was like, whoa, this is accessible to like high school kids now. And just the act of having a mission and trying to solve it is just wonderful. And I think we feel engaged when we make something. And so, Kevin, Kelley, still you keep that Cool Tools website up, don't you? Are you still updating it or putting new cool tools that you find?
Every day we add another user review tools.
Excellent.
Is decentralized through the crowd, like the original Horth catalogs.
Yeah.
Okay, we're all likely to be in quarantine or distancing for a while. So, what are some things that we should be getting or doing or adding to our lives to collaborate and play and learn, Kevin?
Well, you said the key word, in my opinion, which is collaboration. And one of the things I was talking about that I was expecting long before this pandemic came along was that in this coming decade, we would invent, come up with, create tools that would allow up to 1 million people, maybe more, collaborate in real time. And that would be, again, a first for the planet and something very, very powerful. We have tools of collaboration like say the Wikipedia, which is a marvel, just an icon of this era. But it really wasn't done. It was in real time. It was sort of done asynchronously with many people working, at their own pace. But the next frontier is in truly large-scale collaborative tools that would permit us to embark on the scale of a project that would take 1 million people to finish in real time. And we don't really have those tools right now. And I think one of the few silver linings about what's going on right now is that there is a forcing function to accelerate the creation of those tools of collaboration. And it's not just like a Zoom where we're sharing and we're talking. It's a little bit more like the stuff of the Miro board, the whiteboard, where we can begin to collaborate and beyond.
Can you bring me in? Yeah, actually, so I've been trying to capture your stuff, and Kevin, do you have access to the Miro board?
I do.
So one of the things I want everyone to watch is sort of here I'm drawing on this, and it's not great, not super pretty or anything like that, but when I'm drawing, I'm me, and we're sharing my stuff. But if Kevin were to come in and kind of draw near me somewhere, we would see him drawing as well, I suspect. Kevin, do you want to go ahead and let's see if it'll work?
I'm trying to, and I'm clicking, but I'm not getting. Yeah. Oh yeah, I know why.
Grab a pencil.
I know. I'm not. I'm in the. I'm still on the screen. I'm on the wrong screen. Sorry. I was in the. I was looking at the screen that you're looking at, but I need to.
Oh yeah, no, you can't do anything on my screen. You've got, but so Kevin already has a Wacom tablet at home, and about 10 minutes ago, because he's just, he just.
Somebody's internet is unperforming. I suspect it's Mickey. Can you hear me, Kevin?
I can.
Yeah. Okay. Well, these things happen. It happened in Fareed Zakari the other day. Things kept choking here and there. Are you back, Mick? Well, here, I have a question for you. This whole bit about how do people collaborate at scale. One of the things that we notice in this, quarantine moment is people really desperately do want to collaborate. You see all of these groups working on either social distancing or global supply chain. You see all of these global groups that want to do something, and normally they're governed by the friction, or they're flying to a meeting, or there's an airplane. But now everybody's released from that, and you can see that people we have to collaborate together. What would 1 million people collaborating look like? The scale of problems they might take. How do they break it up? Is it the way that a computer chunks something up, or parallel processing chunks it up, or paint a picture for how we might be were we to be there?
It's a fantastic question, and I wish I could have better answers, because it is very hard to pre-visualize what that would look like. To answer the question, is it kind of divvied up in a kind of a timeshare way, where we have lots of individual people working on things that are then super, aggregated? I think the answer is going to be yes. Probably all of the above will happen, at least in the beginning as we try things. Obviously, some of the initial projects have to be things that are going to be easily done remotely. Maybe you're building a kind of a YouTube equivalent to Wikipedia, let's say, or a mirror world, to use the term that I like to use about an augmented reality world that's the same scale as the Earth. It's a 1-to-1 digital twin of the world, and maybe you're making virtual buildings and things at human scale, and maybe it takes 1 million people to make a amusement park, 10 times the size of Disney World. And so how is that? There's lots of questions about how that would be. How do you break the work up? How do you have coordination? How many levels of time scale do you need to make it done? How do you transmit credit? Does money flow through this in terms of payment? What about intellectual property? How is that tracked, if at all? And so I suspect that this might be one place where blockchain might actually be useful in terms of preventing fraud, ensuring security. There's lots and lots of parts that would have to be.
You know, as you bring this up, it puts so many things on the table. It brings the digital twin thing on, right? Because we want to do simulations of things and understand what works before we do the thing, right? So suddenly that's become very current. This probably brings in a level of systems thinking, because if we're all going to collaborate on something, we actually do have to have, okay, here's a model, here's how it behaves, here's all this complex stuff. And this would somehow suggest that this is a thing we all need to be trained on, which to some extent you get trained on if you play a game like The Sims, but there's a discipline to this, right? And then it also brings in kind of all of these intellectual property and shared things that, you know, going back to Vannevar Bush or Ted Nelson or all the things that led to, you know, hypertext and then the web. Here they are again, but in a way more serious.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like Animal Crossing, just sort of the amount of man hours in the world, you know, the sucking sound as human time and energy and creativity is brought to, which is just a game. It's a collaborative game in some ways, but we could turn that around and use that same kind of dynamic and maybe in some of the same attractions. I mean, they're building. It's this yearning to build. We could be building other things that maybe even have the more durable and more useful. And so I think we're not that far away from this. And I do think that there's a lot to be gained in this, because this basically these are hyper real. This is hyper reality. This is a simulation that is so powerful and detailed that it is something in itself. It's a simulation that is a simulation of the world that becomes a world in itself. And so you are both simulating it and operating it at the same time. And
this is such a great setup for this whole complex systems way of thinking.
Sure.
So I want to pose a question and show you a picture. So let's bring up the next slide. And here we are in 1977. I'm at Dartmouth College, and that's my teacher, Daniela Meadows, who helped create systems dynamics. And what she's actually got up on the screen there is she's teaching us to build a dynamic model of a yellow fever pandemic, right? And she's trying to teach us that, you know, certain things make it speed up. That's a positive feedback loop. And, you know, like more people get infected. And certain things slow it down. And the question is this: shortly after she started teaching us systems thinking, I was in Washington, D.C., and I taught a course to members of Congress about computer models. Al Gore actually asked me to teach the course, and I'm like, why do you care about computers? He was a congressman at the time. And he's like, well, we don't care about bits and bauds and byte, but people come with a model, and they say, look, Congressman, the ozone hole will disappear. You have to do all these things. And we taught a class, and we showed dynamic systems, and we showed how the Social Security system overshot and collapsed. And the thing I took away from that was all these congressmen who said it's a really good thing we're elected every 2 years and don't have to think long term because this stuff is really complex. And in the back of my mind, I'm left thinking, here we build these tools that help us see, if not the future, understand complex systems, see how climate behaves, see if we do something wrong, how it will affect things. But people don't. There's something about human behavior that even if you let them see it and play with it and run the game, we don't seem to adopt that. So putting your long now hat on and knowing we have these powerful tools and we behave a certain way, like, what's the hope for how we change that and we use our tools to change how we think? And then we'll bring Azam in, who is building some of these tools.
Yeah, this goes back to something you mentioned earlier at the very beginning of this, that in fact the pandemic was not a black swan, was not unknown. Among many other people, have been involved in several scenario workshops where this whole pandemic course had been run through many times. We'd gone through the scenarios, and their white papers had been written about what to do. The problem was getting anybody to pay attention, getting the people in power to believe it, and to take it seriously. So that's a very different problem of getting people to pay attention to the new tools, to what you discover in science. And I don't have a very good suggestion. Peter Schwartz is also fond of saying that, in his experience, the way you get people in position of power to pay attention to this is that you present it in a way that it makes them seem like a hero if they do. And I would imagine that works, but I don't have any personal experience or suggestions about how that happens. Can't hear you now.
6 with Global SF, which is our international trade organization, and with the World Economic Forum. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the fact that there's enormous inefficiencies in the global supply chain and in sharing information. And when you hit a shock, that's when things fall apart. And their theory is maybe this is a big enough shock that people will make a difference, right? So in a world where people take action when something bad happens, another silver lining might be, well, maybe this wasn't the big one, right? Maybe this was a big warning, and it'll get people to behave a little differently, right? If you tell them it's going to be bad, but it's not, they may do nothing.
Right.
If it's the big one and everyone gets killed, that's not so good. So you actually need.
Yeah, this is just a dress rehearsal for the real pandemic.
Let's take a look at this. I'm going to show you this clip from 1979. I just think this is amazing. Here is Donella Meadows teaching us how to think about pandemics.
And it seems to make sense to me. The more infected mosquitoes you have, the more humans are going to get infected. And then the more...
Did we lose that?
The more humans infected there are to bite, the more mosquitoes will bite them and carry the disease further. Now, suppose that's all there were to the system. How would it behave? Right. It would go up forever. And that's not what our reference mode does. That's why it's handy to draw the reference mode first. On the other hand, there is a sort of exponential looking part of that behavior. So you might say that in this part of the behavior, it's that positive loop that's dominating the system. Now, what I would like to know is what causes this part of the system? What causes the epidemic to stop? Everybody gets immunized or dies. You run out of vulnerable persons. From the point of view of the mosquito, you have a non-renewable resource, right? You've run out of vulnerable people. Have you got that in the model?
So that was from 1979. And if we bring up the next slide, this is a contemporary dynamic system model of the COVID crisis. And Azam, why don't we bring you in, because this is exactly what a system model starts looking like. So this was written just the other day, and you can see some of the things it takes into account are exactly what we're talking about in the news: perceived public risk, public outrage, which speeds things up or can slow it down, stigma, right? These are all things that are brought in. Let's bring Azam in, and your work has been using this kind of thinking to help us design our buildings, our hospitals, and our environments.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, it's always impressive to see these diagrams and help us to understand what's going on. Sometimes, as you showed, we could have started many decades ago, or actually did start many decades ago, and sometimes some things are just too difficult to think about in advance or are non-obvious. And in a lot of ways, as you've mentioned, this current crisis is exposing a lot of different aspects that we probably would not have added to the model. And that's why we have these open questions now of, how do we come back? How do we make sure that we come back differently with a better shared feeling, hopefully an internal feeling that we all have about shared responsibility, that we can actually make things, as Kevin mentioned too, with collaboration, make things better. And in some ways, by staying home, we're all collaborating together now to make things better. So hopefully there's a more active way of collaborating to both make things better, but then to prevent things like this happening again. Like you said, maybe this is not the big one, and we need to make sure that we shut down these wild animal farms and wild animal markets. You know, they were there before with the first SARS, and now again. So, you know, hopefully, the big question we need to ask ourselves is, can we learn?
One of the, you know, when I posed the question to Kevin, we were looking at kind of a global problem like climate, but you are also applying this to very specific things. You did some work when you were at Autodesk where you took a building, which is something we think isn't that dynamic and doesn't change, and yet you put sensors in this office building in Toronto where it could sense how people were behaving, who was being creative, how they were collaborating. We've been talking about tools for collaboration, and the building itself would change itself or tell its managers to change itself. So maybe you and Mick can tell us a little bit about that, and then we have a video that you guys can narrate in a moment, because this bit about making our built environment respond to us, that's one of the coolest things there is.
Yeah, Mickey's back. Okay, great.
Hey, just, you know, internet problems. Go ahead, Azam. If you want to explain or set this up, and as the video's going, I can kind of narrate over it as well. What was the original intention of the Mars project?
The idea was that we had done some of these goal-driven design examples in other cases, and we had this opportunity in moving the office into the Mars building, which is the largest incubator in North America for startups and so on. We had the opportunity to innovate there as well. So we had this unique position where we had a constraint, which is the outline of what the office would be, but we had the flexibility of what should we put inside. So and we had many stakeholders. So you know, everybody in the old office had an opinion of what we should do in the new office. And when we got together as a group and tried to collaborate, we saw we had conflicting goals. And so we, you know, as computer scientists, we said we need to develop some software here to help us manage that. And so we applied what we had done in other previous projects to the office space.
Let's go ahead and run that. Yeah, and I'll just sort of narrate through the video. So here is the constraint. You know, it's an existing building, and it was on a few floors. You can see some pillars there. And one of the ideas here was that there were different kinds of goals. We needed meeting spaces, we needed social spaces. We also had individuals, you know, computer researchers that cared about adjacency and work style preference and buzz and noise. The human ones are really hard because what humans believe are good for them sometimes are good for them and sometimes are not. And so what Azam and his team did was generate basically a whole bunch of inputs. How could we sense this with the lead sensors, and a whole bunch of outputs on the right-hand side, and say, you know, maybe the facility owner owns a few outputs, maybe the individual researchers own some outputs, and then have 1 million, or I don't know, probably more like 10,000 little virtual interns start wandering around the workspaces and applying those goals. So you can see the simulation here as they're trying to reach these high dimensional goals. Buzz is kind of like, where do you stop for the coffee? And where do you take breaks? And doing kind of a fluid simulation of those goals. And so as we spawned all these interns, you know, some of them had like little virtual cameras and little virtual microphones so they could listen about visual and audio distractions. We also know where Toronto is. This is where it was. We could have the sun cast through the day, and we could see if we could put people towards the daylight, because we know daylight actually increases productivity. We also wanted to give people views to the outside, so we had some of those interns wandering around with little cameras with the perfect aperture of a normal human, so we could see if they would be able to see beautiful things. And we sort of spawned all these, and the architect, Anil, and others who were working on the architectural from the practice in New York as part of Autodesk Research, they were sort of taking this as, oh my gosh, in the same period of time that I would have had 5 drawings, I had this massive amount, and humans are not great at looking at lots of things at once. So can I do ensembles, like pairwise combinations, you know, buzz versus views to the outside, and start to look at some that actually hit multiple objectives, and then be able to use those to feed back in the process. And when I talked to Danil and some of the architects and the designers on this, they started calling it jazz. They were like, yeah, it's a little bit like you push this way with the goal, and the goal pushes back, and you kind of play with it. You follow where the algorithm's going, but you also change your goals when you realize that those goals were naive. You readjust the sliders a little bit. And I think the aspiration for this, and Azam, you might be able to talk more about this, was to actually, once you move in, keep sensing. keep trying to see, like, don't turn off the goal-directed system. It's continually part of the jazz is when a facility manager says, when there are so many people in this area, you know, my goal was flag that you should move around some cubicles. And then you could see, oh, was that right? Actually, there's great buzz going on. Maybe we shouldn't. So I'll leave it back over to you.
Yeah, before you build it, you can simulate it. But after you build it, then you can really experience it and collect data from how people are experiencing it. Ask them also little questions from time to time for more subjective things. But you can definitely move the input from simulated input to real input. But you can keep the same analysis. If you have a goal-driven approach, you can you have the same goals as you did before, or your goals might be a moving target as things change. Change is the only constant, right? So definitely the idea is you can keep the overall learning system going all the time, and every day we could generate a new office layout based on what data is coming in of how people are using the space, how productivity could be increased by, and not in the factory kind of way, but because we're a software organization, it was about improving creativity, supporting creativity and software development and research and things like that. So as you mentioned, there are things that give both benefits. So daylight, if we increase access to daylight, it's better for the people, but it's also better for the environment. We use less artificial lights, and people have a better rhythm and so on. So there's a number of goals that should continue regardless. And the overall lesson, I would say, is where do you and this is a general systems issue, is where do you draw the line of what system you're interested in, what's the ecosystem that you're looking at around that, and what subsystems are there that you're modeling.
So that seems like, I mean, in one sense, it's sort of, you always have to pick a place to stop and say that's the ecosystem, because this is sort of turtles all the way down. You could say the ecosystem is just my team, or you could say the ecosystem is my floor. You could see the and the boundaries actually change how you think about things as well. It's sort of different levels of meta-ness. So Azam, you are now working. You just co-founded something, and you're working on some really exciting new stuff. And can you share this new tool set that you're starting to build?
Yeah, thanks. We're excited to start taking this goal-driven approach, and the company's called Trax.GD for goal-driven. Take the goal-driven approach to a larger scale. So as you said, we started with an office, but there was constraints. It was in an existing building, and there's the constraints also in terms of what our scope of what we were attempting. So if we increase the scope to the community scale, the city scale, the regional scale, and ultimately the entire planet, we have this hierarchy of goals. So at the bottom, we have building codes where they're actually more like constraints. They're like, you have to do this or the building will burn down. Mm-hmm. So, but as above that, we have optional things like design goals, operations goals to make sure it's an efficiently operating building. Those exist inside of contextual goals, like at the city and community level. And then above that, we have societal goals, and ultimately adding the environmental goals into that, we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so this system is interesting from the goal-driven approach in the sense that these goals have traditionally and policies are developed by communities, and then they're just written down as text. And that's the barrier that is very hard to cross. And so the mission of Trax.GD is to actually encode these goals so that the computer can help us in the goal-directed way, like the office example, help us explore how to best achieve these goals. Also, by doing that, you can have the computer actually tell you that, oh, actually, you're surprisingly close to this other goal that you weren't even trying to achieve, but if you did these 3 or 4 things, you would get there. So the overall problem we're trying to solve is to implement a goal-driven continuous improvement process that will help everything get better. So for especially long projects that are not as long as the long now, but very long projects, things are definitely going to change over time. And so the question is, can we, and typically they change for the worst, but can we have a system that actually helps you have changes over time that make things better.
So can you show, Azam, can you show us a little bit about what this new tool is starting to shape up, or one of the challenges? You're working with a hospital system right now. And I don't know, Omid, if you can pull this up. They're building a brand new hospital, and they're trying, to extend the system. Can you give us a little, just kind of walk us through a little bit of this?
Yeah. This is the next, if you can go to the next slide there. This is the Nagger Health System, which is close by here. And it's probably the same in the States. There's a complicated process to build a hospital here. And the Ministry of Health here has this capital planning process that involves these 6 or more stages. And it seems simple enough because these are all little checklists of things, but actually each thing is a major undertaking. And this is why, if you go to the next slide, the team there at Nagger Health and Stantec, they've developed this roadmap of what it takes to actually meet the requirements. The ministry.
How big is this roadmap? This is actually a big photograph of a wall that they've been trying to figure all those requirements, and they're almost doing what Donella Meadows was doing. Can we go to the next slide? I think that zooms in on that possibly. So if you just go with the next slide, they were manually doing this. Look at this.
Yeah, this is 240 square feet of sticky notes.
Oh wow. Okay. And so you started working with them to try to figure out, could we actually start putting these goals and constraints into a tool that would allow us to start seeing where the pinch points are, where are the problems? I don't know if that's the next slide, or go to the next stuff.
Before we get there, this is back to the boundaries and signals aspect, which is also a good systems book. If we zoom out, and again, this is about defining your boundaries of what system you're considering. So normally in architecture, engineering, construction industry, we focus on some of these specific little sticky notes, which are deliverables, which take a team of hundreds or thousands of people to do. But our claim would be you're not at the right level of systems thinking. So if you zoom out to that larger scale that includes the entire process, you can actually map out where those deliverables are, and then include, if you go back to the next slide, then you can include not just deliverables like when we create a building information model. Oh, sorry, we're missing that one, but the goals. So you can add in some of those sticky notes relate to the goals, like the well standard. Like we want to have the first well is a wellness standard in buildings in terms of air quality, water quality, and so on. We want to have this be the first hospital that adheres to the well standard in Canada. And you can add in other goals. Some of the SDGs might apply here. And later we have the digital twin. And the purpose of having that in is to also compare the output of the digital twin to the goals like we had in the office.
Do you have an example of what this looks like, just visually? I don't know if that's a follow-on slide. Sort of how your system kind of looks when they're trying to factor in these different goals and constraints?
I think so, hopefully. Otherwise, I can share it.
I mean, go ahead and go to the next and go to the next. So these are like examples of, here we go. And, within a building, there might be different goals at different levels. How cold is it? How warm is it? What's happening in these different things?
This IoT model here, if he continues to play, would show some sensor values in the hospital. Oh yeah, here we go. Some sensor values and temperatures in different rooms. This is actually a Carleton University building, so this is not the hospital. There's no BIM yet for the hospital. We're not at that stage yet. But and you can turn on a visualization of the temperature in the different rooms. Now, equivalently, you could now compare these to the goals. So if the goal is to have, depending on what the room function is, you could now report and measure and have the computer do alterations to either the control system or the physical building and propose new solutions. So in this goal-directed way, and really all machine learning and AI things are based on the system trying to achieve a goal.
Azam, you've been showing us a system here that's a complex system, but of course, it's a hospital, so people have the luxury of taking some time to build it. And as we discussed earlier in the show with Kevin, we are in the middle of a crisis that's happening faster than science, and we're having to make decisions faster than science can even get a consensus. So I wanted to bring Kevin back, and also our friend Tim Chang, to talk a little bit about what it's like to take on a system problem in real time. Now, we met Tim last week. Hi, Tim. Tim's is a venture capitalist with the Mayfield Fund, and he has been working a lot on many of the problems, both the social problems, spiritual problems, the technical issues that come up in this crisis. And we talked last week about some of the work you're doing around spirituality and death and innovation. But you've been running a system experiment this week that we talked about earlier today, and I thought it fit into this conversation really well. The problem is, how does a town know when to come back, when to let people out, how you take testing and then turn it into behavior? And this is a complex thing, but we probably can't wait for the government to do it because we're all operating with all these independent distributed things. So tell us a little bit about what's going on in Bolinas this week. And then I'd love to just get kind of our teams thinking about how this is an example of a system problem and how it might scale.
Sure. When this all hit, I think we were looking for other cities in other countries that were ahead of the curve as maybe previews of what could be done. What was interesting, there was an article in The Guardian. I pasted the link in the chat, which can be shared out. But there was a little town called Vo in Italy, and they did baseline testing for every resident, and that was the path towards them moving forwards. So I think a lot of what's missing is basically the data at a population level within a community. You can't make any decisions since you have that, right? And so that's the baseline starting point. And then we saw two entrepreneurs in Telluride, Colorado, try to replicate this in a small town there. They were able to secure their own tests, and we thought, oh, they're in our expanded community. Let's get in touch with them. Let's replicate the Telluride playbook out in here in the Bay Area. What we did, there was about 10 of us, the two leads, Yuri Engstrom and Cyrus Harmon, were actually residents of Bolinas. Bolinas fits the profile well. It's only about 1,700 residents, secluded, rural. Median income is below actually the average Bay Area income for a community. One road in or out. So it fit that pattern for a place to pilot this kind of playbook. And the thought was, let's do this at the hyperlocal level. Let's group fundraise. Let's, we're smart. We're entrepreneurs, investors, founders. Let's try to figure out a playbook bottoms up. Because like you said, Peter, it's clear help wasn't coming from the top down anytime soon. So let's see if we can be more resilient at the local level and just step up. Really interesting learnings. It took about 3-4 weeks of prep. It wasn't the tests that were the bottleneck. There were more tests than we needed to do with because FDA relaxed the emergency usage allowance. Last count, there's more than 44, I think, vendors now with EUA on the FDA site, and more coming. So sifting through the noise level of all these tests with the marketing claims that this is perfect, it's got high accuracy and specificity, we had to partner with UCSF to really find tests that could meet the need. And based on their benchmarking, a lot of these tests hitting the market just weren't cutting the mustard. So we went with 2 tests, a PCR molecular test for active presence of COVID and an ELISA assay for the antibody determination from a finger blood prick. But the big surprise learning was it was operations and logistics that was the bottleneck. We ended up bringing in a world-class Burning Man camp and music festival organizer because the details we have to attend to, from different drive-up lanes, coordinating phlebotomists, med students, collections, PPE, liability, paid security, all these things were what culminates in this playbook. And the good news is I think it's definitely replicable. This was initial pilot, got it down to all in $200 per person, 2 test types, every resident, including infrastructure and paid phlebotomists, paid security, all of those sort of things happen. So it feels like it is a tool.
Tim, I know Kevin has to leave us shortly. And Kevin, I just wanted to bring you in before we go. Here's an interesting example of kind of a global problem that's being sliced up in one place, and like jazz, maybe the kind of thing that is a little bit of what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. We're going ahead faster than the speed of science because this probably won't be peer reviewed, and it should be peer reviewed because we want to try and do it again without having to wait for that. And so it's an example of the kind of accelerated learning that I think some of these tools are bringing about, where in the past you wouldn't have been able to hear about these kind of results in any other way, except almost in the way that we're doing right now. And I would expect even further acceleration of the speed in which some of these we call it kind of quasi science is being done. Not that you guys are not doing the most careful weight is possible, but it's still not at the level of a consensus that we would normally have in a scientific method. And I think we're going to see more of what you're doing, and I think that's a good thing.
Tim, I've got a question on what happens next. Now we're testing, and presumably this is going to lead to a protocol about how people can come out and assemble, right? Which then would lead to all of these issues about ongoing contact testing, privacy. You know, are we wearing wristbands? How do we trust people? Because this suggests a kind of the social kind of thing in a U.S. local version, our version of what either China or Hong Kong or Singapore did. So how are we going about that kind of IT problem?
So it starts with a population level sample for the data. A lot of the research institutions don't even have that. So for the name of science, this is sort of a small sandbox just to collect that data at a population level for a small town. From there, then we can look at community policies and as communities figure out what to do. But it starts with who has active infection, what the quarantine policies there, and then do contact tracing to see what were the vectors in, vectors out, who may have antibodies. Of course, it's not clear if antibodies truly confer lasting immunity of any sort. So it's too soon to make policies based on that. Our hope is that if you have antibodies, you have the so-called golden hall pass to go out and about, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. If a town was to be as strict as to cut itself off and close that road in or out, it theoretically could reopen. But now that's going to be a really different matter if towns are willing to do that and enforce that, right? But that is a consideration to look at. But it starts with the population level baseline data for the status.
Well, you can really see why this becomes a general systems problem quickly, right? Because you constrained it physically, but we have a much bigger issue on our hand. Well, how do we think this stuff? I'm very curious how this stuff will scale. Will we end up with Apple and Google deploying something? Will the government do it? Will corporations do it? What's the mechanism that's going to introduce some form of come out and safety, some new equilibrium here?
I got to tell you, one of the resistances from some residents to get tested was this question. They were like, is this a for-profit interest? Who's going to have my data? I don't want some company to profit off this. And rightfully so. That's a good worry because, you know, these sorts of things can lead to worries about Big Brother, you know, tracking, all those sorts of things. We designed this to be carefully anonymized and nobody's keeping the data. But that is a suspicion that's going to be out there. So you can imagine if corporates try to release solutions, even if they have their hearts in the right places. I mean, you know, would you trust Google or Facebook to be putting this out there? There could be parallel efforts, though. Imagine employers offering this kind of program for all their employees, such that they could start to maybe have team meetings again. I'm expecting that those programs will start to pick off at some point.
Mickey and Azam, you're both in touch with populations around the world. I'm wondering how how you're seeing some of these immediate problems being dealt with. And Azam, I'd love your thoughts on kind of these potential differences between the longer term stuff you're looking at and then what happens, as Kevin says, when we apply these things faster than science.
Good question. I mean, I think the way we can sort of or the most important thing we can do right now is learning. So as Tim does these experiments, which are awesome, you know, if we can express our goals and then think carefully about how to measure the success of the program, and then that'll help us think about and learn what could be different or what we need to generalize to apply these kind of things other places. That same systems approach, I think, would be needed, especially as we have pockets of places that may be safe and open, and then how to connect those. And that could lead to a larger plan of how to actually incrementally open things up.
Yeah, I think, bring me in. Yeah, I think when I look at what Tim's doing, I'm like, wow, this is amazing, right? We hear about it somewhere else. They figure it out. Turns out logistics and planning and filtering through all the noise is the hard part. Over time, though, you're going to start to say, okay, what are the high dimensionals of the goals for human life, for individuals versus society, getting the company, getting the economy working again. Those are trade-offs, and exposing those trade-offs. One of the things I learned in working with Azam and the team in this goal-directed approach when we were looking at building buildings or building products or things was that just putting the goals, like actually focusing on goals and constraints and obstacles and defining what you cared about. and actually having that conversation with people, like being able to say, okay, if I had a slider, tell me the range of that slider between, don't share anything, or don't fly at all, or fly a little, or fly a lot. And by exposing those and then putting them into a system model, so you could say, okay, I'm going to spawn 10,000 little machine learners to go try to see what would happen in a year, in a week, in a day, so that I could expand that, would allow us to start doing what ifs that are a much richer kind of idea of what's going on. So I think Azam said we need to learn now. I think the other part is, how do we start? I mean, I wish we had a goal-directed system or a goal-directed tool the same way we do have in, like Fusion for products, or in Revit or other things for buildings and the kinds of things you're building, like Trax.GD. But I wish we had one for a pandemic, or for that kind of thing.
Can I tell you my wish?
Yeah.
I want to throw so.
Yeah.
I've been trolling a great deal on Facebook in the last 24 hours, or my friends who are like, open everything up, we need liberty. And I'm like, okay, well, that's actually the federal death zone program. And then they yell at me because I'm a liberal. And I'm like, well, yeah, but there's a pandemic. So my wish is, rather than us yelling at each other, if we were all forced to play a game, like we actually had to play the pandemic game. And then if you didn't like the fact that people got hurt, you could change your assumptions. Like, no, it really isn't contagious. Or, okay, nobody's actually going to come into contact with each other. But somehow it turns it into a conversation.
Sort of cooperative. Yeah, like a cooperative model. This reminds me a little bit of what they did in Hamburg with the City Science Lab, where they actually built these Lego little towns, and they had people come in and try to figure out, okay, what do we do with all these immigrants? That's troublesome because they're coming as refugees in some ways. And then what do we do with trying to actually bring the Olympics to Germany? And the mayor brought in these kind of Lego models that actually were video projected from City Science out of MIT. And they would, like, everybody, the citizens would pile up Legos, and it would calculate, oh, that tall of a building or that many cars. And what happened is, people who just wanted to be spoil sports, they were telling me the story, basically just fell by the wayside because they couldn't come up with any answer that would actually move the score higher. And the goal was to move the score higher. And so how do we, I do think gaming, or the play part of this, where you go, okay, you try, like, go ahead, adjust the variables. And if you've got a hypothesis about some, the resolution's wrong or the ranging is wrong, cool, let's put that in as a new dimension, the fudge factor or the different thing. But articulating that and getting it on the table feels really important. Azam, it looked like you had something to say.
Yeah, and it's even better if you can do these kinds of games with people that have some experience with it. So Tim, in the town, before you leave, let's do a systems modeling session with these people, and collect their feelings about different things. You mentioned a few things like privacy and concerns about data and so on, but what about all of the other parameters that go into something like this? That would be fascinating.
Yeah, and Peter, it could be a little microcosm. Yeah, Tim, I'm sorry, go.
Well, I was thinking, Peter, you had brought this up in another chat we had. Is back when the Great Depression hit, the New Deal had things like the Works Progress Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps. Might those be systems and tools we use to put people back to work, not just in person, but maybe virtually? There'll be lots of services needed now. You and I have been to several digital funerals. We need chaplains and therapists and whatnot to potentially administer and preside over these things. Those are new forms of digital work remotely, even in person. For this Blenus project, it was people with background in events and music festivals. All those people in the sidelines right now. You could put all of those sorts of folks who have, catering, hospitality, events, conferences, whatnot, back to work, because every town might need to outsource or hire professional teams to run logistics for these kinds of test programs. The logistics are pretty intense.
This connects back a little bit to what Kevin was talking about earlier, which is, what do big, massive collaboration things look like? And what you're describing was actually, Dale Doherty kind of brought this up on, I think, our second show, when we were, the show was called The Commander Is Us. It was basically there is no commander. We're figuring this all out. It was kind of on bottoms up emergent behavior. But then he came back with Tim Ryan, because he and Tim wrote a proposal that was along the lines of the Civilian Conservation Corps. But
Tim is a congressman in Ohio. Yeah.
Yes. Who's running for president and is, come from a manufacturing distance and a bit hollowed out. So he's been thinking a lot about workforce, deployment. But the concept here was that Well, one, you had an awful lot of people who were at home who might not be as productive as they were, but needed to be productive. And you needed an awful lot of cognitive capacity kind of deployed in new ways, Tim, as we've been discussing, like whether it's around grief or contact tracing or stuff like that. And how might you spin it up? And the idea was a form of national service, but a rapid deployment form of service.
Well, and I think there's this element of learning, which is, the Green New Deal and all the other things that people were talking about. This notion, there are trillions of dollars of jobs to be had and business to be done if we actually took those sustainable development goals and those IDG goals seriously. And we said, look, there's a whole generation of people who could be putting solar panels on the roofs of buildings, who could be doing other things when we can get out. But even now, getting up to speed on this stuff and being able to be effective, it's probably going to stretch everybody in little ways, right? Those event planners who are normally used to planning, a big music festival. Well, guess what? We may not have these big music festivals for a while, but they are incredibly good. When the show goes on, they turn it on, and there's so much planning to make it look like no planning happened at Burning Man, for example. That it's just, there are really rigorous things going on there. And so how might we kind of upskill people right now? I'm really impressed with a few of the companies out there who are actually not laying people off, but are actually saying, how hard it was for us to find people. And they're actually just doubling down on saying, okay, grow yourself, do the master class in this, do the thing in this, start to do this. And certainly just helping locally would be huge, right? And it also bonds the community back.
Yeah.
This, one of the things we try to do with this, with Quarantine, is be action oriented, which is to say we're not just talking about stuff, but we are connecting to communities doing things and then being part of projects. So maybe as we wrap up today, Tim, a lot of this is an expression of kind of the Bay Area innovation and tech community trying things. What are some of the mechanisms that people can collaborate on to spread these ideas out? I'm thinking, if the whole world is going through this crisis, maybe it's an opportunity that for education models or people, almost playing this as a simulation to understand what you're describing right now could be replicable in other cities. On the quarantine groups, we've got teams that are working on these things. So what are some of the actions that people can take that can apply some of the systems thinking to the tasks at hand now, in addition to, say, this WPA style idea?
They're involved in quarantine. I thought that was a great coalition trying to put people on task force projects. They posted something really powerful. It was the, what was it called? Second and third order effects of COVID mental map. And it showed how every aspect of life, from work, play, school, parenting, etc., needed to be innovated upon. And those are all potentially work streams and project task forces that need to be spun up as we adapt life to this new reality. There's a myriad of ways to plug in for a lot of those efforts there. They're supporting the death and end of life efforts, the public awareness of the need to stay in isolation. They'll probably be helping amplify these open playbooks for communities. That's one group I thought that was pretty interesting for people to plug into.
In fact, that group is what actually inspired this show. When Erica and that whole group was starting it probably 2 weeks ago on a Saturday night, we were talking about all these things, and then that led to, well, we ought to connect people up and talk about it. And they've been off writing playbooks. It does strike me that a lot of this stuff is this connected bottoms up stuff. And I had another thought that flying out of my mind, so I'm going to throw over to Mickey while I continue to have that thought. Mick?
Well, yeah. And I remember we talked a little bit about the second and third order effects map. We've got it up on the resources page for quarantine.today. It was interesting. I tried peeling away the layers on the second and third order effects map. And what I wanted was somebody to teach me how to think about second order effects. Like, okay, what's a methodology to take an existing thing and play out second? What's a methodology that someone else plays out third, so that we can do round robin on this? And while it was a nice doc, it was a big flat doc, what I wished is it was parametric. I wish that when you shake it over there, it shakes over there, right? Which is the way the parametric world works. And the kind of stuff that like Azam works on is intimately, deeply tied to phenomena. And I'd love to kind of be able to associate that with a graph, sort of the COVID second order effects graph. and be able to kind of see if you turn this or open up this floodgate or tighten up or shorten down that feedback loop, what new second order or third order effects pop out, which kind of brings us all the way back to the Donella Meadows comment about how do we model these complex systems, and then how do we step back and give people a chance to kind of turn the dials and do what ifs, and play that in a simulation role and invite people in before we play it out for the world with humans. I don't know. Can you, Peter? Are you still there, or anybody there? Pull us back in if you can, and we should probably aim for wrapping up. Azam, you had a little animation that was kind of the graph that you were doing, where instead of drawing these, with me drawing a pretty pixel pencil, but that's just ink. You had the ability to basically say, okay, if we really take all these different intersecting levels of problems, oh wow, look at that. By encoding them as dependencies and connections and weights on the graph, you were able to basically expose to the hospital system, wow, this is where the bottleneck is, or this thing here. And I don't know if you could pull that up, or if Omid could pull that up. I'm not sure if he has it, so it might just be you pull up your desktop and share your screen.
Sure. Let me just set that up here. I'm just going to go to the website actually, so I can also paste in a link to that.
Yep. And then just do the share your web page kind of thing if you can do that, we can just show it later. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Yeah. So in the
walk us through this
project here. If you go to projects, Nagger Health, and scroll down, you'll see the animation of once we have a digital version of the map, of the roadmap, then we can explore in different ways and expose, critical paths or bottlenecks. There's one node that flies by there that everything feeds into, and that expose that to the team, because when you draw it by hand, you have so many overlapping things, you can't see that. So
so the idea is almost you could flip it polymorphically. I want to rearrange this whole thing by this node so I can see the effects of it and do other things. Yeah.
So I'd love to see a graph of Tim's experience with the town, like in terms of action follow-up things. Like the most interesting thing for me about modeling systems is not just can we model what's happening at the statistical broad scale, but can we model the interactions where we actually poke the system and see how it changes it. So in a specific town where we go through a playbook and do things, what is the outcome we're expecting, and how much of that happened, and what counteracted it. So modeling the actual inputs directed to purposeful interventions in a system.
Purposeful signal, poking the hornet's nest and and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll volunteer.
I think one of the ideas that ties all of this together is this notion that this is such a fluid time for change, or such an opportunity for what's coming next. And I think, Tim, one of the reasons that you're so animated by this, as a VC and an entrepreneur, moments where change is afoot, or it's highly leveraged, or you can see one old system might be being displaced by something new, is what animates you, particularly if it can do some good here. And when we're talking about the second order effects, some of these are the second order effects that are the bad stuff that goes on in the middle of this, like grief and things like that. But then we know we're going to come out of this, and we've had some insights about society, about efficiency, about collaboration, about what it is like to be single-minded and purposeful. And really what we're all talking about is how do we capture that? And I think that's a lot of our mission ongoing with what we're going to do with this show and the work that we're all doing. As I mentioned, on May 6th, we're going to do a show with Global SF, our International Development Organization, and the World Economic Forum. And the big insight from that is that the thing that hurts global supply chains are lack of information, ports that aren't sharing information, not understanding what demand is, and then you get into a crisis. So it turns out to be completely conforming to how things are open or shared, and how do we understand something as a model, and then get explicit about how do you build things more resiliently. So we could be much better off with something like that in a whitewater world. Likewise, really interesting thoughts on where our work and professional lives are going. You talked about this a little bit last week, Tim, when you had this thesis about, are we building more compassionate systems? Are we building more resilient systems? And how work will change. My friend Keith Fox, who I was with at Apple for many years, ran marketing there and was at Cisco, had a post earlier this week on people seem to know how to save money on cooking. They may not be buying as many frivolous clothes. We may be more productive. Today on Techonomy, David Kirkpatrick was talking to people in the fashion world. Is there going to be a change in maybe purposefulness? So I think that is an exciting area for us to look at, because we're going to be coming out of this probably with different priorities of what we work on and what we value as a society. And back to the very point that Kevin made at the beginning, it's very tough to get people to think long term. This was kind of the annoying insight that the lockdown had as we headed into this, but this may be one of those moments. So I would love to just to wrap up on some version of how we don't waste this crisis, or how we inject kind of ongoing change. And maybe I'll start with you, Tim, because, as we said last time, you have to answer to limited partners. So you're sitting there in this very real world of deploying new kinds of companies and ideas. And to do this, we want to animate not just, kind of our little cloistered community, but the whole nation and the world as its common problem.
Yep, agreed. I think we're going to shift towards more resilience, like we talked about, more innovation at the community and local level. This could be a return to decentralized systems, and hey, maybe use case for blockchain after all, right? I think we'll see, people have been calling it disaster tech. I like to think of it as resilience tech, but this will affect, we were talking about architecture earlier. What if houses now need clean rooms at the start that are like airlocks? We'll see all sorts of interesting changes there. But the biggest one is there are some innovations and workflows that will come out of that out of this period, even when we can go back to in-person, we'll want to keep, because they'll be so much better and so much more effective that we won't want to just go back to business as usual. So that's been my mantra, is now we all have a reason to go to business as better. And I mean, there's some aspects of this that are more, efficient, relaxing, especially for us knowledge workers. And I recognize that's a privileged position. Not everybody has that, but there'll be ways that we can work more effectively, more remotely, such that we don't necessarily want to just go back to the default of being in person in the office all the time anymore after this.
And Azam, you're working with some of the most powerful, potent tools that we have that essentially let us model the physical world and then change it. So I'm sure you started your company before there was this crisis, and you're actually working with the health system. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what you've learned working with these tools, how you're looking at things a little bit differently now than perhaps 2 months ago.
Yeah, the main change I would say is which is a big change, is the perspective of like Tim suggested, like a clean room interior zone and things like that. And these are not new ideas at all. So I mean, people that design laboratories have different zones that have different protocols and how to pass things from one zone to another. That's a well understood, standardized procedure. And we can encode those standards so that they can be applied to all structures or even between structures, and we can learn from things like that. So the major change I would say is adding trying to encode things that could be more broadly applied throughout the built environment, and then also to understand how different aspects of a laboratory, for example, could go into your home or anywhere, so that, or your car, or whatever it is that takes you from here to there. So or it takes any package. So there's a layer that I'm hoping will come out of this as well, which you referred to earlier, in terms of getting people to think about long-term problems, and if we can convince them that actually all the long things that we think are long-term problems are actually also short-term problems. So with the United Nations SDGs, this is called the decade of action, because we have a limited time to before there's some potential no way back. So we should apply that as well in the virus situation. And so there's actually some exciting things to consider a future that looks like that, where we can have this more flexibility, and also people buying into it because they've experienced some of these things.
we've covered so much territory, I think, just in the 3 weeks that we've been doing this, that all of this is at quarantine.today, which also has links out to the Quarantine group that has been developing manuals and books and kind of ways of responding to this. This is Kevin talked about this whole thing moving faster than science. The amount of knowledge and how to deal with this has also been growing exponentially. And for all of our internet and tools, we're barely able to get it out there. So we have some of it on our site, and we'll continue to cover this stuff. Mick, why don't we wrap up with you? You have been obsessed with this whole question of tools and how we can amplify our ability to collaborate.
Yeah. Omid, pull up the whiteboard a little bit. I've been trying to kind of keep track, and I do my best. And we happen to be using this mural board, which is at least persistent and infinite and symmetric, asynchronous, which means anybody actually right now could go onto the board and put a Post-it note up. One of the things I just heard Azam say was, we've been doing these laboratory things for a long time, but they're in these laboratory things. They're not like in our house. They're not like in our restaurants or things like that. And I think what he just demonstrated was this leap of analogy. And it was this leap across a metaphor space and an analogy space. And that turns out to be one of the most important things when we're like trying to navigate this really complex, space, is trying to figure out how to get from one point to another. And I recently read a book called Life Finds a Way by Andreas Wagner. He's a Santa Fe Institute scientist. And he actually looks at 3 billion years of how life has been creative and how it's actually been able to help us get to this point where humans we have things that like there are no machine learning systems have, like common sense, innateness, passion, and we can actually leap across analogous spaces and metaphor spaces very dramatically. I don't have any tools to do that with other than my brain and your brain and everyone else's. And I think my hope is that we slowly get to a point where we can have shared cognition and we can have collaborative cognition to make these leaps. I've mentioned Richard Feynman once or twice, and his whole approach was, if I can know everything that needs to be known, I can extend it. And he would make a list for 10-year-olds to explain whatever the new topic is he was trying to learn. And anything he couldn't compress down to an analogy or a metaphor or use common language, he didn't know. And he would go back and research it. So he tried to do a 10-step tutorial for 10-year-olds. And I think we all need to get better at saying, tell me a metaphor, tell me an analogy for this. How can we do this? And we don't have many tools that help us explore that. So my last recommendation is that book, Life Finds a Way. I think that's all we got. We're going to do more cool tools episodes in the future as well.
Have you noticed since this crisis began, we've been talking less about artificial intelligence and how much more we need people to get stuff done?
Well, humans I wouldn't count out. I think we're pretty glorious.
We're trying to use. Okay, Tim, thank you so much. We'll continue this. That was great running into you this morning on our call, and I just think it was terrific to be able to share what we had here. Azam, there's so much going on with this digital physical interface to model things. We're just scratching that, and it just strikes me that the kind of conversations we're having here about systems thinking and these tools to help us get ahead of rapid change, these are just going to become a lot more common in the next couple of years because we do live in this more complex world. And the more we share these things, the more we can probably come to some consensus and work together. That's probably the thing that ties us back to what Kevin said. What are the ways that we can all collaborate at scale? And shared models must be one of them. So,
yeah, sure. For sure. Shared models is the AI part. So maybe more than machine learning, we can go back to the old AI part and collaboratively author these knowledge graphs.
Well, gentlemen, it is now 5:28 Pacific quarantine, and that means it's probably time to go find the wine that we have and move on to the weekend.
It is time.
And prepare for a week in which the kind of the national agenda is thinking about the future and how we what we build next. So thanks, and we'll see you again on Wednesday on quarantine.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quantum time space while we draw.